Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Jordan Taylor as our visiting scholar for this quarter. Give you a little bit of background. Dr. Taylor has a BSc in Aeronautical and Astronautical Engineering at Purdue University. Full boiler majors. He got his his master's and his doctorate in biomedical engineering from WashU in St. Louis. He then went on to complete his postdoctoral training with Richard Ivory at UC Berkeley. And then he moved on to Princeton University, where he still is today, where he's a professor in the Department of Psychology. Dr. Taylor's research aims to advance our understanding of the different computational processes that support motor learning and retention of those learned skills. In particular, over the course of his career, his work is focused a lot on the interaction between explicit and cognitive strategies and more implicit mechanisms of motor learning. But when we do these introductions, I always like to sort of share a little anecdote or fun thing about the person. And I wanted to share that Jordan's work, particularly early in his career, had a really big effect on me and shaped a lot of my career research trajectory. So his early work was among some of the first to start looking at what at the surface level kind of can seem like very simple manipulations of training conditions and feedback. And in particular, some of his work that kind of did this very careful feedback manipulations where he really spanned kind of the continuum of how much vector error information we can give someone and looked at these really careful behavioral dissociations and like how those manipulations affected learning and published a lot of work on sort of what are the underlying neural mechanisms that support each of these, how do they interact, how do they talk to each other. And it was actually a review article that he wrote or published with Rich that kind of covered a lot of this work that when I was just graduating from my PhD, I came across. And it sort of blew my mind. And it was the first thing that really got me thinking about, how these different brain networks work together. How can we start to leverage them? Can we start to train training conditions to sort of help certain people damage to one network versus the other? And I say all of that because to me, Jordan's work is incredibly interesting. And I'm really excited that he's here today. And I'm really excited that some of you who maybe aren't as familiar with it get to learn about it. And I hope we'll drink and welcome to Jordan.
Thank you so much. The wonderful Philadelphia. I feel more pressure. Last time I was here, I was interviewing for a job, and I don't remember if I was in this room or not. But I was very nervous then. I'm still nervous now because I'm going to give a talk on stuff I've never talked about. So it's a brand new talk. And I really like feedback, criticism. If it's interesting or it's banal, let me know. Please interrupt at any time. For clarifications, because also I haven't smoothed this out. So maybe a little rope around the edges. But to start us off, did you know that Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and Baa Baa Black Sheep are the same melody?
Yes.
Everybody? No? All right. So then you will go. Okay. If you look at the notes here, right? It's all the same, right? And it's the lyrics that are different, right? So the melody. If you knew that Baa Baa Black Sheep was the same as Twinkle Twinkle, how about the alphabet song?
I don't know.
There's little subtle differences. Like if you want to have a note played on every time you say a letter, right? You can play the note, but it's the same note. Right? So there's like subtle differences, and you can change around that way. It turns out these are all from an 18th century French tune, and even Mozart did 12 variations on this melody. Okay. But the case is this: my daughter is learning to play the piano.
Oh,
okay. So if she's playing piano and she learns Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, will she immediately generalize to play Baa Baa Black Sheep? Right? Will she have the two and be able to play it immediately, or the alphabet song? Right? Now we have this like in our, it is something like if it's represented in the sequence itself that you're executing, right? Then she'll have like muscle memory. Right, and then be able to play this immediately with 100% kind of transfer, right? So do you think, like, does anybody have any kind of feelings whether this happens or not? Or does she learn them separately? Right. And this really gets underneath this with this example is what is the representation that she forms when she's playing or learning Twinkle Twinkle Little Star that may or may not allow her to generalize to something like Bow Wow Black Shoe or the alphabet song. Okay. Now, generalization, Roger Shepard put forth, like, should be the first law of psychology. Okay. And what people were doing, this 1987, what people were doing beforehand was looking at things that associative learning and doing a classical conditioning task and train a rabbit. No, here's the note C, gets an air puff. And then they would change the note to, like, say, C sharp or G and see if the animal shows the conditioned response, right? Did it generalize from C to G, right? And you could do this on a, physical frequencies, right? You could do this across other things like color. If they saw a color light that was red, condition the response, then change it to orange or teal, does the animal show the conditioned response, right? And what people had seen is that there didn't seem to be any kind of invariant law of generalization. Every time that you conditioned, let's say within the music or tone domain, didn't have the same function as it did in the color domain, or across many other domains. There's just on the paper of different things like shapes or sizes or whatever kind of conditioning that they did, or any kind of learning that the animal did, that there was no universal kind of function, and that Roger Shepard thought that should be, the one that would put forth the first law of psychology. And what he did, right, was say, okay, we're just going to look at the generalization data itself and try to, like, backpedal out and make a psychological space. Does the animal think, or the human, right, think that two things are the same and they should generalize? It becomes more of an inference problem. Okay? And so this starts off to get this universal law of generalization. And just recently, in 2024, his, like, proposal was kind of, like, let's say, validated in a massive online study where they had people rate the similarity between, let's say, a tiger and a bobcat, right? And you're rating on a scale of 1 to 7, how similar do you think those are? Right? So if you think they're similar, then you would then generalize your knowledge of tigers, right, to bobcats. Right? If they were dissimilar, then you would, right? Maybe a tiger versus a house cat. What they did a little bit even more on this is that they asked things that would be more for, like, conceptual generalization, as they made up this enzyme. If animal 1 is this fake enzyme, how likely is it that animal 2 has this, right? And what you get out of these is you get this exponential function that holds once it's in a psychological space, or multidimensional scaling is the technique you use. But you get, compared to all the other models that are out there, Roger Shepard's exponential fall off based upon similarity is what predicts whether you're going to generalize or not. And so this would kind of predict whether or not my daughter was going to generalize, right, between Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and Bow Bow Black Sheep, right? And so she could have some kind of, right, whatever your concept is of a sheep, right, has some kind of representation for the neural hardware, neural network, right? And that whatever concept is in those, in that neural network, that's going to be somewhat distinct from something, say, like a Philadelphia cheese stick, right? So your knowledge of this wouldn't transfer to this. That would fall off, here. This would be the sheep down to the Philadelphia cheesesteak. But things that are closer, nearer concepts may have something. So, right? So there's some kind of gray. So this is my daughter. She's an animal. Maybe she's cute. She can't play Bow Bow Black Sheep. Neither can the sheep. Right? So there may be some kind of shared representation that could predict this. And so the underlying question of all of this is that, is there some kind of psychological space that influences motor generalization? Right? So if it's those lyrics in the song, does that then constrain whether or not I want to generalize across this? Okay. And so we set out to test this. They have some kind of game that's kind of like playing the piano, where you would learn some melody, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, have some kind of neural network representation, and then see if it's transferred into Bow Bow Black Sheep. Now, if it's in the motor domain, right, that's in the sequence, then there would be like 100% transfer. If it's in some kind of higher, kind of more psychological or inferential space, then it may not transfer. And you can think about this. If it's in muscle memory, then if she practiced Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and she's improving it over time. And then she switches the blah, blah, black sheet. She already knows the motor sequence. And so her learning curve would continue, right? She goes back to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and continue on the curve. So it'd be one kind of lumped representation. Like if for some reason that the lyrics are strong enough to contextually separate these, and she doesn't think that they're similar, right? Then she would get no generalization. She would create a split representation. The Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star is in that kind of like little network, right? And blah, blah, blah actually is here. And so whatever kind of learning she had for Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star would not generalize to blah, blah, black sheep, and it had their own kind of learning functions. So a postdoc in the lab set out to do this, take the piano kind of idea of the game and say, okay, we're just going to have people do this on a keyboard, and they have to do this finger tapping task where they have to type out SAFSD over and over and over again, okay, using their left hand on a computer keyboard, okay, and they would get it in this kind of melody context. So instead of just seeing this on the computer screen, they would see these notes on the stack and would have the key corresponding to the note, okay, and they'd press. They would see like it would be press S, it would turn purple, and press A, that would turn purple, and then if the sound works. And so you'd hear that melody along with it. So it's just a motor sequence task with this kind of superfluous context on, right? It's all there available for the person to learn. It has the context. And just as a proof of concept, we want to have a different,
I assume the subjects did not know how to read music because those labels are not correct.
No.
If there was any knowledge that would.
But it didn't correspond to, it didn't correspond to the keyboard either, right? So it's like they're pressing SAFSD, right? So it's just the superfluous. Oh no!
But if you have musical experience and you hear those.
The notes. Yeah.
You may be, and especially if you have pitch.
It was randomized. So I don't know whatever south of my head was at this note, right? So whenever you got you got the right notes with the staff,
Okay.
but it was different for every person. So this is just the example.
Okay. Thank you.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
I
got this from my
Okay.
postdoc. And then the other context that's superfluous would be, we call a maze context. And so this is like a side scroller Mario platform. Okay. So that you have this little dinosaur, you press S, it jumps over the cactus, you press A, it ducks underneath the balloons, and it would animate across the screen. Right. So this one, you get the music with it. You see the letters change. Here you see the little animation. Sorry, I couldn't get the animation to work from my postdoc's jet. Okay. So you're doing the same sequence, but just potentially in two different contexts. Same motor. Single sequence, same motor. So have people do this, for like half an hour or so. In a control group, you've got no context, which is just seeing this on the screen, which is like the typical way you would do a finger tapping task or a discrete sequence production task. It's different from an SRT task because you're not queuing for it. It's always on the screen. And they would just do this over and over again, no context. I would get this kind of speeding up of executing the sequence. Even though it's seemingly a trivial task to do this, people get faster over time. Okay? And in between these were just little 10-second breaks. If you add on the superfluous context, like the maze, okay, you're just doing only the maze, you only ever see the maze, it's largely the same as having no context, right? The information's there. Maybe it's a little bit slower because it's intentionally distracting to see the dinosaur move and jump over the cactus. If you do the melody, it's right on top of the maze, okay? So nothing distinct about maze versus melody. But the question is, what happens if you start to do melody and maze? So you do, whatever, a minute of doing the melody, and then you do 1 minute of doing the maze. And you probably guess I wouldn't be talking about this if it was the same. People are incredibly slower, relatively speaking, when you're switching the context. Okay, so it's the same motor sequence. The only thing that's different is this superfluous, irrelevant. It's task inconsequential. It's just there on the screen. If you knew the sequence, you had memorized and closed your eyes, it wouldn't really matter whatsoever, right? It's the same exact thing. So they're slower to do this maze melody context together. If you break this up, this is ordered by keeping the sequence aligned. If you break it out by time and separate out into its context, you see basically two distinct learning functions. You got one learning function for learning in the maze context, in red, and you got one function with learning in the melody. then effectively no transfer, right? So again, trying to reach there, but if you're master there, when you switch the context to the melody, you go like you've never played it before, right? And then you learn, you come back to here, you pick up where you left off, right? Where you come back here and pick up where you left off there, right? And so to us, I was telling the man about this, is that we didn't intend for this to exactly happen when we were doing another experiment. And this consumed us now of how you got this context dependent separation or split of these, single motor tests that you had to learn. Okay. And what we could ask with this is, what are the representational dynamics that are underlying this learning? How did this single sequence get split or context linked to these basically two different superfluous dynamics? Okay. Now, what people have gotten with I'd say a big splash, at least since 2021, just in the motor control field, is this idea of latent cause inference. Okay. And so this work by Heald and Bulford looked at that contextual inference was underlying sensory motor learning. So you're making some kind of inference about the context, and your experiences, the sensory cues, and the feedback that you got are going to be linked with that context. And you're going to make some kind of estimation about, if you're in a new scenario, am I going to generalize that because I think it's the same task or the same context, or not? Okay. Now, this work had its origins in work by Sam Gershman and Yael Liv on this latent cause, but more kind of in the conduct. But the question here is, how do we explain that if I think these two situations are the same, then I should respond the same. Right? If I think they're different, then I should respond different. And the way that these models work, they're kind of at the symbolic level, right? That you have some context that you're estimating. I'm in this blue context, okay? And if I'm in this context, there are some cues that I'm getting, whether it's my melody or delays. There's some feedback that I'm getting that are linked to that context, right? And I can set up more than one context. If something changes, I can split off into a new context, right? This is a symbolic level model, and it's nice. You can kind of explain it. You can write out the equations, but you can't really get into like the dynamics at more of a, say, at least one step closer to a biological level of what's happening in the brain. And the other approach to do this would be to use a neural network. Okay, this is not in this kind of thing like playing the melody. Does not lend itself well to doing like an fMRI experiment. Right? The melody's kind of too fast, it's too slow, or it's not measurement of it. But we can maybe get an idea from neural networks. And this is a long tradition of looking at how different kind of learning scenarios cause interference or generalization, right? There's like how this two sides of the same coin. But what you have is neural network, simple ones, from what is 1989, just a simple element network or a simple recurrent network. You got an input layer, a hidden layer that's going to be doing the learning, and then a linear decoder for what it's producing. And then in a sequence task, you can have inputs like, what is the context you're in, maze or melody, and you can have the sequence, which is the items that you're pressing. You have recurrence in the hidden layer, and then you decode the hidden layer that just did, well, the guy you're going to press A, S, D, or F. Okay. Now, from this, you can see the paper title, this is catastrophic interference, that these networks really, really struggle to separate two things. And they tend to learn or lump together the learning experience. Okay? But more recently, it's become clear that ways that you initialize the network can get the behaviors that are either like lumping or screwing. And what I mean by this is that in here, you have weights, right? From the simple layer to hidden layer, you can have weights in other places too, but they can have different variance in how they're initialized, right? And this is called, and pardon me, I didn't come up with the names. This is the names from cognitive science and computer science. That if you have variance that's like really, really low, okay, that is called a rich network, okay? And if you have variance that's distributed much more broadly, that's called a lazy network. And what this ends up doing is that it causes, if you have this broad, it splits the representation. So things are learned kind of in a rote memorization way. It's like every item or everything you're doing is this context, I'm learning this. Something changes, I'm learning that. Versus this one, you're kind of learning more of the deeper structure. And you can think about this like where these would go is that you can memorize to play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, right? That would create that network, right? Then you get Bob Bob Black Sheep, you'd create that network, right? And they would just be memorized. Or you could like practice scales and intervals and scale degrees, and you could learn something more deeper about the underlying structure or grammar of of the learning, right? So at least in my experience of like playing the guitar is that when I was young, I did a lot of memorization. I wanted to play this song and I just memorized it from the tab or whatever and didn't even know what note I was playing, right? It doesn't help out much because when you want to go generalize, you didn't learn anything besides moving your fingers, right? I didn't know anything. And what I was supposed to be doing is practicing scales and learning progressions and things like that, which takes work and I didn't want to do. Okay. And so this could be two kind of ways. And so if you set up this initialization of this network, you either have broad weights, more variance, or more narrow variance, then you can get these kind of splits. So in the lazy network, this is like learning the sequence task. You get this split if you set it up with really broad weight distribution. If you get narrow, it will create one kind of learning function. And if we could take this and then try to compare it to humans did, right? And having it learn, this will have robot neural network learning to produce this. And it's given just basically two contexts with a one hot content component. And this is what you get for the rich. So this is the human data, okay? And we put it in the rich network, learns kind of basically one representation. And you put it in the lazy, you get this kind of splitting, this kind of transition costs and going to one context to another. And so you can get this just through initialization. And the nice thing that you get out of this, because we have the neural network, is we can kind of look at like what is the representation in its psychological space. So you can look at the principal components, or if it's like human work, like multidimensional scaling, you can look at the principal components, and you can see how this evolves over time. Okay, so under the rich one, you only get one representation that's formed. This is moving through this kind of psychological space. In the split context, when you have this kind of broad initialization, you've got two contexts. Like, so when you're in the maze context in red, that's how you're carving out or tracing out the representation of space. When you're in the melody context, that's the space that you carve out, right? And the degree of overlap between these will tell you whether you generalize. Like whether or not the person thinks that these two things are similar, and then they would cross over in the space. Right? And that goes back to the original kind of idea of Roger Shepard, that the closeness in your representational space will predict how well you're generalize. And so there's good things and bad things about generalization. Maybe you want to keep things separate, or you want to push them together, right? You can cause interference, or you can cause like something like a skill to build up. And so we've just started this kind of work. And we're seeing now, where we're going is we're kind of build this up and basically do this in a parametric way. And one of the grad students in the lab, Tommy, is taking this and doing basically a parameter sweep across these tasks. You can imagine that we can say, here's a sequence that you got to play. Here's another sequence that you got to play on the keyboard. How similar does a person think they are? Right? By executing, just focusing on the motor similarity. Okay, you could use something like cosine similarity to give you something. You could give yourself something that's objective. Let's say how different are S from D or A from that. But we had people, or Tommy had people, rate the similarity between the sequence. They would do sequence A, then they do sequence B, had a scale 1 to 7, how similar. Okay, and that is all of the possibilities here, 435 comparisons. And you look at it and say, is there any kind of structure there? I don't know. The size of the diagonal is kind of low, but you can do the same kind of thing with on the melody side. Okay, and so you can say melody A versus melody B, how similar they are. Looks to be a little bit more structured. The nice thing about this is that people are reliable between themselves. So I think it's something on the order of like 0.6 correlation between subjects. So if you're looking at inter-rater reliability tests, that the melody actually comes out quite high. This comes out really low. I don't forget the number, maybe like 0.1 on the motor sequence. So what's happening in this test, when people are thinking about it in terms of the context that it has, right? Whether or not it's the blah blah black sheep or twinkle twinkle little star. And then cutting across this is curriculum, right? Is that whether or not you're interleaving these all the time, or are you doing kind of block training? We're practice twinkle twinkle little star for the 1 week, and then I'm going to switch to blah blah black sheep for the next week, right? Or I'm going to do twinkle twinkle little star today, and then blah blah black sheep an hour from now, right? And you can take these networks, and this is basically the power of this, and we can do all of this in simulation, and then go pick out the next cases and test it in humans. And what we're planning to go ultimately is look at something like training that does a musician's have, right? Or anybody has in sports, right? Did you do something that was smooth in your training, where you focused on one thing for a long time, and then did something really, really close to nearby, right? So you did Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, then you went to Baa Baa Black Sheep, then you went to Mary Had a Little Lamb, then you went to the Happy Birthday song, right? Those would be kind of similar. Or did you jump around a lot? Like you did Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and then you did Moonlight Sonata, right? So they're very different, right? And then you went and played, I don't know, Crocodile Rock, right? Those are very different contexts. So if you run the network this way, you can get very different representations just on the curriculum, right? So you get one that has this kind of ring shape, right? And this generalization representation, or this kind of star shape. Ultimately, what I'm going to say is that this defines like how well you can do things. And so I don't know if you know the classic kind of story from Coltrane on studying the circle of fifths. So the circle of fifths is like our relationship that people codified in the 18th century about how different keys related to one another. Okay, and Coltrane studied this. This is his drawing of the circle of fifths because he wanted to create a musical piece that was dynamic, constantly moving. It switches keys every 2 beats, right? It goes between 3 very different keys. I forgot the exact keys, but it's basically the case like if you're thinking about this, if you were doing something that was close, it'd be like, you know, Spanish to Italian in language versus Spanish to Japanese, right? And so in music domain, that's when he was trying to create that Spanish to Japanese. And when there's a classic story about this, when he came in with the sheet music and he gave it to the piano player that was supposed to improvise over, Tommy Flanagan, he looked at it and was like, didn't know how he was going to possibly do it. And his style of playing, because he had to think of what is eligible in every key when it switches from, you know, B to G or something, what is eligible to play. And his style of playing was a little bit halted or disjointed. And actually that recording went on the, you know, so this is something that you can set up how you're going to generalize. So I just wanted to say that's something that we're like at least excited about and where we're heading. But I know you guys are probably thinking about what about real motor control? Okay. So again, piano, it's fun for me to think about, but I know it's about rehabilitation. So we wanted to think about these ideas inside something at least about reaching a point. So my graduate student, Ipe, also a talented graduate student, made a little video here, doing a sensory motor adaptation test. And so in a sensory motor adaptation test, a reaching test, using your mouse cursor, you see a target presented on the screen. They're trying to bring this cursor to the target. They can't see their hand. It's underneath this tablet here. Okay, so you should be this supposed to appear. And then we put on a 45-degree rotation. So they move straight, it goes off by 45 degrees. And over time, they'll slowly learn it, right, and get kind of a gradual learning function. And so if you plot this is movement number or trials on this axis, hand angle on this axis. This is before the rotation comes on. Rotation turns on, they have to move their hand 45 degrees in the opposite direction, and they get this learning function, right? Classic power law learning function. And then when you at the end of the experiment, you turn off the rotation, take the cursor away, have the participant reach the target, so aim directly to the target, and then have this after the fact, right? And this is kind of the implicit signature of motor learning. Now the question in here, right, in this kind of more traditional adaptation task is what happens in generalization, right? And the way that we study this is that you would train at one target, and then after a while, if that's your learning curve was done, then you would introduce other targets to move to, right? And what people do, they show this classic Gaussian-like function that this is where you train. If you go to a nearby target, right, you're showing an 80% generalization. You just go a little bit further away, just 45 degrees away, okay? Then you're dropping off down now less than half, right? When we go a little bit further, you're getting down to the floor, right? And this has always been the case. And looking at this is that it falls off by the angular distance away from each ring. So the question here, we wanted to know, right, in this idea is that are there psychological factors influencing this? Right? The most obvious one is that spatial separation. Okay. And so this started off with work with former postdoc in the lab, Eugene Poe, and the other people on the team, you might know Sam was on this, was that we wanted to ask what people were thinking of when they did the task. right? And so we did a delayed match to sample task. So we had people reach to this target. So they presented with that target. They'd reach the target, okay? And then there'd be a target over here. They reach that target. And we'd ask them, how similar were the two tries on a scale of 1 to 7, right? Right. So nobody had ever kind of looked at this. They just give you the targets, the generalization. But now we're going to ask them how similar. And so you might say, well, that was very different. That was 90 degrees away. So I'm going to rate that as 6, right? But then you give them a different target, like one that's closer by, right? Closer to the sample target. And maybe they would give it, much more similar. And so we did this across the workspace, densely sampling around the target because that's where the generalization function is the highest, right? And then we include these as well. I had people rate over and over and over again, how similar do you think those two movements were? They weren't given any other instructions. We don't know exactly what their similarity was based on, right? Most likely it's based on distance, right? That's the only kind of salient feature in the task. And you can create this function of their subjective similarity, right? So this is on scale 1 to 7. Similarity judgments based upon target angle, then it has this kind of Gaussian-like function, right? Then we had them do an adaptation task, right? So they got a 45-degree rotation, then they had to learn to counteract. Here a learning curve, okay, that learned really, really quickly, right? And then we're going to ask them about where do you reach with no feedback at other locations on the order space, okay? And this is the function that comes out, right? It's that Gaussian function that, John Krakauer showed in 2000, right? And so you're in this Gaussian function, right? And the question is, how well does the subjective one predict the motor generalization, right? And so you can just move this over, right? Looks pretty good. If you do some normalizations different ways, you can get basically an R squared of 0.7 predicted by their subjective judgments, right? So they think the two movements were the same, right? But it is based upon targeting, right? That is the most salient feature, right? It also could be based upon if there was any kind of perceptual confusion. How well can you tell that this target is different from this one, right? If you couldn't tell, then you would generalize, right? If you could tell, then you could choose not to generalize, right? So we did a quick perceptual confusion test. Now we just ask them, across all those targets, were the two trials the same or different? So it's a binary response. And what we get on discriminability is a very narrow range. People are basically 3.5 degrees is their ability to detect change in our setup. I think that absolute number I would bet on. This is not a kin arm. It could be different on other devices, right? But about here's 3.5 degrees. And if you compare that to the motor generalization is much broader than the perceptual generalization. Okay. All right. So now with this, what we really wanted to do was say, let's take it totally to an abstract space. So if we change something superfluous in the task, right, can we change the pattern of generalization? Like before, it was linked to the directions that we've been moving. And so that's what everybody thinks it's coded in, kind of the muscles or the joint space, right, or the extrinsic workspace. But what about if we just change the shape of the target, okay, and we did it in a parametric way from what is like a hexagon or pentagon to a star, right? And so you could parametrically do this and say, if you give them a sample target, so that's that pentagram, they reach to the pentagram, and we change it to a star or something along that scale, and we have them rate it, right? They might say, now that's very different, okay? And then we have them do the adaptation task. It's only one single target, right? So they learn, counteract a 45-degree rotation, right? It's good. And then we give them a generalization test. And it's not a space, but it's along that parametric dimension, right? From pentagram to star. Okay. Now what we get here is a motor generalization function that looks what? Right. Now this is not on direction, right? It's only one target location, right? It's just on the psychological or subjective shape of the target. And now you're getting a generalization function. Now people, they trained on the pentagram and you change it to a star, will reduce their 45-degree angle now down to 4 degrees, 5 degrees, right? If it's a little bit closer, like a fatter star, right? Now they're generalizing 30 degrees of their 45-degree learning. They weren't told anything about this, right? They just chose to change the way that they generalized. And if you take their ratings and match it with their generalization function, you get a correlation, R squared 0.85, right? So they're changing that represent whether they're not just based on this abstract feature. Now, the psychological space is multidimensional, right? And so what we wanted to know is like, what if we kind of pitted these two things together? There was a kinematic or spatial one, which is like the angle of the target, and then an abstract or psychological one, which is the shape of the targets, right? And what we had people do is in the generalization test, we said, why don't you, they saw all these and say, okay, I want you to generalize, go where you think you should go to get the cursor around the target if it's based upon shape, not direction, okay? So what you get there is you get this generalization over shape. That's what you kind of solved. As the shape changed, no matter where it was in the workspace, it fell off like this. And you then sort it by direction, right? And you get this flat parts. So it's not as they were told to do by shape. They were then generalizing by shape and not by direction. If you do the reverse, tell them to generalize over direction, not shape, then we get the one that's on target angle falls here, right? That's the generalization function. And then there's a slight influence based upon the shape. And so there's still someone maybe can't stop or still think it's important, right? And the idea here is that this is an inference process. When we do the generalization experiments, we'd have them train at one target, then another target will appear. The person has to say, do I think of the same? Should I reach the same? Right? And so all of that goes in. And the most salient feature of most generalization tasks were the different directions, right? But it could be something else, right? As long as you cube them kind of into it, then they could maybe factor that into whether they're going to generalize. And we kind of had a sense this is probably an explicit process. And so I'm not talking about this book today, but I had worked on how to distinguishing between explicit learning or re-aiming, like I see my cursor's off, I'm going to re-aim over here, versus implicit, like changing that kind of underlying sensory motor map. And you can predict the overall learning function based upon an explicit process where I think I should go and an implicit process that I'm not even aware of, right? And you can do tricks that kind of, in some relative way, isolate explicit learning and implicit, okay? I say relative because they're not like foolproof, it's not 100%, but it does like 90% of the work. So if you delay the feedback of the cursor, then that basically stops implicit learning from working. And you can also do this kind of clamp test where they don't have any control over the cursor and the people won't meander. But what you get here is that when you do explicit, it matches basically the highest correlation with their subjective ratings. So their generalization, it's a conscious or like controlled process that they want to do. Implicit, not. Implicit cares just about the location and the workspace, just the direction, not about the shape. Okay. And then we kind of have fun on that. And just to kind of put this like a little bit to the test, we thought, well, what people really have been trying many years to figure out context-based dual adaptation. So if you're learning a clockwise perturbation versus a counterclockwise perturbation, what kind of contextual cues allow like the learning to be linked and separated and consolidated and protected, right? Or do they cause interference? And one more paper kind of went through like the kitchen sink of all the kind of context that people use. And you get this kind of, a little bit of this parametric kind of thing that comes out is that the degree of abstractness matters. So if your contexts are like color, cursor color, background color, they cause basically the complete catastrophic interference. Clockwise perturbation will overwrite counterclockwise perturbation if they're just linked to red and green. Okay. But if you get into things that are like workspace locations or proprioceptive based locations, then you can start to get separation between something that's running clockwise versus counterclockwise. And one of it has to be, what's cool about it is that it's high, it can be like in a higher order function, and that's in the planning. And so like one thing is like, even if you're traveling through the same physical location, if your endpoint was going to be angled somewhere else, so like a follow through movement, so you move from here to here, but you have to follow through here, then you can separate things out. And all of this was going towards saying, and hey, the context seems to be something that's really, really relevant for the motor system, right? That is something about workspace, proprioception, the joint kinematics, those allow the separations, right? And things that are abstract don't. But we thought, well, what if we made that like a little bit more integrated in the task? So this is just a background color, like is the screen red, screen blue, but we actually had it be linked to what you were supposed to do in the test. So this is work that I did with Raphael and Matthias Higala, to have them have like an action outcome association for what they're doing. So in this one, they were controlling, like, imagine this is my cartoon version of it, is they're controlling a flame, and what they're supposed to do is explode the target. So they'd reach the target, and then, the target would explode. Okay, that's the action outcome association. And that was linked to a counterclockwise rotation. And then they have another one, which was like paint the target. So you control like a paintbrush, and you go to reach the target, and then you paint it. Like, and that is linked to a clockwise rotation. And what we found is that kind of action outcome association could then separate the two methods. So you wouldn't get catastrophic interference. And so this is the total learning. It should be going 45 degrees here under the paint condition, pretty much the arc, same with the flame. So now we got dual adaptation on an abstract kind of concept. But all of that learning is in the explicit domain. So it's under explicit judgments. It's that they can use that context to re-aim their movements, but the implicit based learning causes interference. This seems to be highly tied to the physical locations in space. It seems to be mixed between extrinsic and intrinsic reference frames. Something about the joints, something about the space is defined in those, which would give this kind of curve that's complex because it's based upon a link to where they're planning. Are they planning to go plot? Planning to go counterclockwise. But a little bit of that is causing catastrophic interference. So ultimately, we want to get towards this universal law for motor generalization, right? And across two domains, one from playing motor sequences, like in the context of piano playing, that we can get this kind of easily get kind of context split. Now, personally, I really want to know this kind of thing because I experience this. I'm practiced terribly in my guitar, as I can feel this kind of interference that happens. That when I learn a new song, it's somewhat like I forget and overwrites or bleeds into the old song, right? And I'll mix together different measures in the context and kind of separate those or allow them to come together and actually generalize, right? But what we really want is to do this with something like any kind of motion, whether it's reaching, right, or it's walking, to kind of generalize of what you've learned, right? So your skills can build upon one another. And I think this goes down to, if you think about, at least in the first two order dimensions of this, right, you've got this kind of case of there are things that are most salient for motor control, right, are things like the kinematics of how you're moving, and then what you're trying to do with the goal. And I took Laurel's paper, I dropped it in ChatGPT and said, put little cartoons on, right?
Oh, thank you.
But Laurel was getting at this question, right? And didn't you say, like, for example, a corkscrew, a light bulb, and a key, all have kind of motions together, right? But you can also have things like that are, together, like a remote control versus a keyboard, right? Or causing some kind of change in the function of what you're doing, right? With kind of, so you can think that in your representational space under motor skills are getting lumped in some high-end dimensional space, but big ones might be on what you're trying to do with that function of it, which is like the kinematics of how you move it, right? And ultimately, I know that, I do basic research. We only occasionally work with people with neurological disorders, but, the holy grail, or I think, I guess, is like getting this generalization from the clinic to the real world, right? You bring in an individual that's going to rehab in the lab, right? They can see improvements, but then classically, when they go back home, right, you don't see that generalization transfer, right? And so I think, at least in my world, whatever, that these kind of basic science things, right, are aimed or seeking to kind of get this to work, right? And if we could also use it outside, like a fundamental perspective, it's optimizing your learning in general. Like, what kind of contextual cues can either cause you to have a lump representation or a split representation, or what your needs are. Maybe you want to have them split, or maybe you want to have them lump, right? So you can just select and use these kind of tricks to accelerate your, number of skills you have and build up your motor repertoire, right? That's one of the features of humans, right? Is that we don't have to learn everything from scratch. Not everything has to be associative learning, right? Or conditioned, right? Or use shaping to get us, right? We can use something about our knowledge from before, leverage that, and learn something much quicker. So that's an interest I've always had, and been a long time trying to build it up. And I realized that. Thank you for listening to me ramble on about this. And everybody that actually did all the work that people in bold and people does the work that I talked about. And thanks to our funders. And then one person that I didn't talk about that is V.E. Wang. He's doing an incredible postdoc in the lab, doing lots of work on algorithmic versus retrieval strategies in sensory motor education, doing TMS, neuroimaging, and big part of the lab is all on an explicit, implicit kind of distinctions, which I didn't really talk too much about today. But I saw that Laurel posted a job here on Twitter, and so he was one of the hardest working postdocs and most enthusiastic with machine learning is. So you'd be remiss not to consider him for the jobs I'm evaluating. Because I didn't talk about his work, I live in plug. So, thank you very much.